12 years. That is how long Margaret Calloway let one man decide everything. What she ate. Where she went. Who she spoke to. What she wore. What she was allowed to feel. And on the single worst morning of her entire life, the morning her mother stopped breathing, her husband looked her in the eye and told her she was not going anywhere. She obeyed. Like she always did. But what Derek Calloway did not know, what he could not have imagined standing there in that hallway in his pressed shirt with his coffee going cold on the counter, was that his wife had just become one of the wealthiest women in the United States of America. $85 billion. And he had just walked away from every single cent of it. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story you are about to hear is one that is going to stay with you for a long time. My name is not important. What matters is the story. And this story begins, the way so many devastating ones do, not with a crime, not with a fight, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a choice. A quiet, ordinary choice that a young woman made when she was 27 years old and deeply, completely, dangerously in love. Margaret Ann Calloway, born Margaret Ann Hartfield, grew up in a home that most people would never walk past twice. It sat on the western edge of Raleigh, North Carolina, on a long stretch of private road flanked by white oak trees so old they had names. The house itself was a Georgian colonial with 12 bedrooms, a library that held over 4,000 books, and a kitchen that always smelled like something was already on the stove. It was the kind of house that does not announce its wealth. It does not have to. The wealth is in the quiet. In the stillness. In the way the floors do not creak and the windows do not rattle and the garden always looks like it was designed the morning you arrived. Margaret's mother, Eleanor Hartfield, had built that wealth across 4 decades through a combination of real estate holdings, media acquisitions, and private equity investments that most financial analysts did not fully understand until after her death. Eleanor was not a famous woman. She was not on magazine covers. She did not attend charity galas for the photographs. She believed, and she said this often, that the loudest person in any room is rarely the most powerful one. She had learned this watching her own father lose a small fortune chasing visibility, and she had spent her entire adult life doing the opposite. She built quietly. She accumulated carefully. And when she finally stopped building, the number at the bottom of her financial statement had grown into something that even her own attorneys had to read twice before they believed it. Eleanor had one child. One daughter. Margaret. And from the time Margaret was old enough to understand money, Eleanor made a decision that her daughter would never fully know the extent of what they had. Not out of shame. Not out of secrecy. But because Eleanor had watched too many children of wealthy families lose themselves in the knowledge of what they stood to inherit. She had watched them stop working, stop growing, stop becoming. She did not want that for Margaret. She wanted her daughter to be a person first. The money, Eleanor always said, would be there when it needed to be. Margaret was 23 when she graduated from the University of North Carolina with a degree in art history. She was 25 when she started working at a small gallery in downtown Raleigh, hanging other people's paintings on white walls and writing descriptions of the work that most visitors read while holding a glass of wine and nodding without fully understanding. She was 27 when she met Derek. Derek Allen Calloway was 32 years old the first time Margaret saw him. He was standing at the back of a gallery opening she had helped organize, wearing a dark navy blazer that fit him well and holding a glass of sparkling water he had not touched. He was not looking at the art. He was looking at the room. That should have told her something. She noticed him because he was the kind of man who carries himself like he has already won something. Not arrogant in the loud way. In the quiet way. The way that reads as confidence when you are young and reads as control when you are older. He had broad shoulders, dark hair cut short on the sides, and a way of making direct eye contact that made you feel, for a moment, like you were the only other person in the building. Margaret was not looking for anyone. She had not been looking for anyone for almost a year, ever since a previous relationship had ended badly enough that she had decided she needed at least 12 months of being alone. She had made it to month 10. And then Derek smiled at her from across the gallery floor and she forgot what month it was entirely. He was a real estate broker at the time. He had his own small firm, 3 employees, and a client list he was building from scratch through sheer force of personality. He drove a clean black sedan, wore good shoes, and paid for dinner every single time without making it a statement. He was the kind of man who knew how to make a woman feel taken care of before she realized she was being managed. The first year of their relationship was extraordinary in the way that first years often are. He was attentive. Present. He remembered small things, the name of the painter whose work she admired most, the coffee order she gave without thinking, the way she always held her shoulders tight when she was nervous about something. He paid attention to Margaret in a way that no one, outside of her mother, ever really had. And she loved him for it. Completely. Without reservation. The way 27-year-olds love when they do not yet know enough to be careful. They were married 18 months after that gallery opening. Eleanor attended the ceremony in a cream dress and said very little about Derek in the days leading up to it. She danced with her daughter at the reception and held her hands for a long moment before they let go. Margaret noticed the pause. She told herself it was emotion. Later, she would understand it as something else entirely. Eleanor had been watching Derek Calloway very carefully from the moment she met him. And she had seen something that her daughter, standing in the warmth of new love, was not yet able to see. She did not say anything. Not that day. Not for a long time. Because Eleanor Hartfield understood something about control that most people learn too late, that you cannot drag someone out of a situation they have not yet identified as a trap. You can only make sure that when they are finally ready to walk out, the door is wide open. The first year of the marriage was fine. Not extraordinary, the extraordinary had faded by month 14 of their relationship, as it tends to do, but fine. Functional. Derek's business was growing. Margaret had stopped working at the gallery. It was not a dramatic departure. There was no argument, no ultimatum delivered at volume. It happened the way most of the significant changes in their marriage happened, slowly, through small adjustments that individually seemed reasonable and collectively amounted to the complete reshaping of her life. Derek had a way of framing things that made it very difficult to argue. He did not say, "I don't want you working." He said things like, "You deserve better than running around after people who don't appreciate you." He did not say, "I want you home." He said things like, "I just think we can afford for you to focus on things that actually matter to you." The problem was that Margaret had not yet worked out which things actually mattered to her, and Derek had, without fanfare, positioned himself as the person who would decide. By year 3 of the marriage, Margaret had stopped working, stopped painting, something she had done quietly and consistently since college, stopped seeing most of her friends, and stopped driving herself places unless Derek was traveling for work. None of these things happened because Derek said, "Stop." They happened because Derek had built a household logic in which Margaret stopping made sense, in which it was easier and quieter and less complicated for her to simply, not push back. Not insist. Not ask for the thing she had been about to ask for. Just let it go. And then let the next thing go. And the next. Until the person she had been at 27 was something she could remember but no longer quite locate. Eleanor watched all of this from a distance of 400 miles, which was the distance between her home in Raleigh and the house Derek had chosen for them in Richmond, Virginia. She called Margaret every Wednesday evening. Sometimes the calls lasted an hour. Sometimes they lasted 7 minutes, because Derek would appear in the doorway and Margaret's voice would shift, not dramatically, not in a way she would have been able to explain if pressed, but Eleanor heard it. A mother always hears it. She started noting things. Writing them down in a small leather notebook she kept in the top drawer of her desk. Not because she planned to do anything with the notes immediately. But because Eleanor Hartfield had not built an $85 billion enterprise by being careless with information. She kept the notes. She watched. And she waited. By year 5, Derek's business had hit a wall. Not a visible one, he maintained the appearance of success with the precision of a man who understood that perception is everything in real estate. The cars were still nice. The house was still beautiful. The dinners out were still at the right places. But behind the clean surface, things were deteriorating. 2 major development deals had collapsed within 6 months of each other. A partnership he had been counting on dissolved after a dispute that was never fully explained to Margaret. His income, which had once covered their lifestyle with room to spare, was now falling short in ways he had started managing through a combination of credit and very careful misdirection. Margaret did not know the numbers. She had not known the numbers in years. Derek handled the finances. He had offered to explain it all to her early in the marriage and she had said she trusted him. He had smiled and said he knew she did. The financial pressure changed Derek in the way financial pressure changes men who have built their identity around being providers and have not developed any other architecture for understanding who they are. He became quieter. More controlling in small, sharp ways that had an edge to them they had not had before. He started timing her calls to Eleanor. Not obviously, he would not set a timer or walk into the room and hang up the phone. He would simply appear, with a particular look, at a particular point in the conversation, and Margaret would feel the familiar tightening in her chest and begin wrapping up. He started making comments about Eleanor. Not cruel ones, Derek was rarely cruel in the obvious way. But comments that planted seeds. He said Eleanor was manipulative. He said Eleanor had never really approved of him and that her disapproval had always been about money and class. He said that Eleanor kept calling not because she loved Margaret but because she wanted to keep her close, keep her dependent, keep her from having a life of her own. Margaret listened to these things and did not fully believe them, but she did not fully disbelieve them either. And that is exactly the kind of space that a man like Derek Calloway knows how to work. By year 8, the calls to Eleanor had dropped from every Wednesday to once every few weeks. Eleanor did not mention it. She called when she called. She said what she had to say. She listened when Margaret spoke. And she continued writing things down in her small leather notebook, which now had a second volume sitting behind it on the same shelf. She had also, quietly, in a meeting that lasted 45 minutes with her longtime attorney Richard Marsh, begun a conversation about the future of her estate. Not because she was ill. Eleanor was 71 and in excellent health. But because she was a woman who did not wait for crises to begin preparing for them. She told Richard that she had concerns about the environment her daughter was living in. She told him she had concerns about the man her daughter had married. And she told him that when she died, whenever that was, she needed to be sure that what she had spent 40 years building could not be reached by someone who had spent 12 years dismantling her daughter. Richard Marsh listened carefully. He took his own notes. And he began drafting the most detailed estate plan he had ever constructed in 32 years of practice. Year 10 arrived the way difficult years do, without announcement. Margaret was 37 by then. She was quiet in a way she had not been at 27. She moved through the house carefully, the way people move in spaces that belong to someone else. She had learned to anticipate Derek's moods the way you learn to anticipate weather, not by understanding it, but by watching the signs. A certain set to his jaw. A particular quality of silence at the dinner table. The way he held his phone face down when she walked into a room. She told herself she was fine. People who have been told for a long time that their perception cannot be trusted develop a particular relationship with the word fine. They use it as a floor. As long as things are fine, they are manageable. As long as things are manageable, they are surviving. And surviving, when you have been reduced to it slowly enough, starts to feel like living. Derek's business, by year 10, was in serious trouble. Not theoretical trouble. Real trouble. He owed money to a private lender that he had used to float a development in Charlotte that had stalled. He had taken a second mortgage on their home in Richmond without telling Margaret, something she would not discover until much later. He had, in the months leading up to everything that was about to happen, been quietly investigating what Margaret might stand to inherit from Eleanor. Not by asking Margaret. By other means. He knew Eleanor had money. He had always known that. He had simply never known how much. He had tried, early in the marriage, to establish a relationship with Eleanor that might eventually yield information or access, and Eleanor had been unfailingly polite and completely impenetrable. He had tried, through Margaret, to understand the structure of Eleanor's finances, and Margaret had truthfully told him she did not know. He had believed her, because what Derek Calloway did not understand, and this was the thing that would ultimately cost him everything, was that Eleanor's decision to keep Margaret in the dark about the money was not negligence. It was architecture. In the fall of year 11, Eleanor Hartfield was diagnosed with a progressive heart condition that her cardiologist described as serious but manageable with the right treatment protocol. Eleanor listened carefully to the prognosis, asked 3 precise questions, thanked the doctor, and drove herself home. She did not panic. She did not call Margaret immediately. She sat in her library for an hour with a cup of tea and thought about what she needed to do. Then she picked up the phone and called Richard Marsh. The meeting they had the following week was the one that would change everything. Eleanor had already put in place the broad architecture of her estate plan 3 years earlier. Now she needed to build the final room. The room that would handle the specific situation of a daughter in a controlled marriage who was about to inherit more money than most governments spend in a year. Richard would later say, in a private conversation that was shared with only a handful of people, that in 3 decades of estate law he had never seen a plan constructed with that level of foresight. Eleanor was not vindictive. She was not petty. She was not trying to punish Derek. She was trying to protect Margaret from a man who would, upon discovering the size of the inheritance, immediately attempt to access it, control it, or leverage it in ways that would tighten the walls of the life he had already built around her daughter. The plan Eleanor and Richard constructed was legal in every detail and devastating in its precision. The inheritance would go to Margaret directly and solely. It would be structured in a way that made marital asset claims extraordinarily difficult to pursue under Virginia law. And it would contain a clause, quietly inserted, formally filed, professionally worded, that required Margaret to engage independent legal counsel before any information about the asset total could be formally shared with her spouse. Eleanor did not know exactly what Derek would do when the money arrived. But she had been watching him for 11 years. And she knew enough. Eleanor Hartfield passed away on a Tuesday morning in March. She was 74 years old. She had gone to bed the night before after finishing a book she had been reading for 2 weeks, eating a bowl of soup she had made herself, and calling Margaret to say goodnight. The call lasted 11 minutes. Eleanor told her daughter that she loved her and that she was proud of her. She said it simply, without flourish. Margaret told her she loved her too. She said she would call in the morning. Eleanor said that sounded good. And then she hung up the phone, put it on the nightstand, and went to sleep. She did not wake up. Her housekeeper found her at 7:15 the following morning, looking, according to the housekeeper's later account, like she was still sleeping. Peaceful. Completely at rest. As if she had made one final decision and was comfortable with it. Margaret's phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. It was her aunt, Dorothy, Eleanor's younger sister, who lived 20 minutes from the Hartfield house and had been called by the housekeeper. Dorothy's voice was calm. Dorothy had been a nurse for 30 years and she understood that the kindest thing you can do for someone receiving devastating news is to be steady. She told Margaret simply and directly. Eleanor was gone. The words arrived in Margaret's chest like something solid. She sat up in bed. She put her feet on the floor. She started moving, the way the body moves before the mind has caught up with what is happening, the animal instinct toward action when everything else goes still. She went to the closet. She started taking out clothes. She was going home. She was going to her mother. Derek was awake. He had been awake for 20 minutes, sitting in the kitchen with his coffee and his phone, reading something she had not been invited to see. He heard her moving in the bedroom and came to the doorway. He looked at her for a moment, her face, the clothes in her hands, the particular stillness of her body beneath the movement, and he said, "You're not going to that funeral." Not a question. Not a request. A statement. The way a man states something he has already decided. Margaret stopped moving. She looked at him. She said her mother had just died. He said he knew that. He said the timing was not good. He said he had things happening this week that needed her here. He said her aunt was there, her cousins were there, she would just be in the way, she would just upset herself more than was necessary. He said, and this is almost impossible to sit with, that Eleanor had never respected their marriage anyway and that maybe this was not the worst time for Margaret to start putting her marriage first. Margaret stood there in their bedroom doorway holding a gray sweater and a pair of dark trousers and she looked at her husband and she did not say anything. She went back to the bed. She sat down. She put the clothes on the floor. And she picked up her phone. She called Dorothy back first. She said she could not come right now. She said there were complications. Dorothy, who had been a nurse for 30 years and who had seen more human suffering than most people can imagine, did not push. She said she understood. She said she would call with arrangements. She said she loved Margaret. Then she said one more thing, quietly, before they hung up. She said, "Your mother left a letter with her attorney. She said Richard Marsh had been trying to reach you. She said you should call him as soon as you can." Then she hung up. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that. Derek had gone back to the kitchen. She could hear him in there, the sound of a cabinet opening, the particular scrape of his chair. The house was very quiet around those sounds. She called Richard Marsh at 8:15 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. He said he was so deeply sorry about Eleanor. He said your mother was an extraordinary woman and the world is smaller without her. And then, because Richard Marsh had been doing this for 32 years and had learned that there is rarely a good time for important information and that waiting never serves anyone, he said, "Margaret, I need to speak with you about your mother's estate. I need to speak with you today, privately, and I need you to understand before we begin that what I am about to tell you is going to require you to make some decisions. Are you somewhere you can talk?" Margaret looked at the closed bedroom door. She looked at the gray sweater on the floor. She said, "Not quite." She said, "Give me 1 hour." She drove to a coffee shop she had not been to in 3 years, because it was on the other side of Richmond from anything Derek would go to, and she sat in a corner booth with a tea she did not drink and she called Richard Marsh back at 9:07 in the morning. He talked for 41 minutes. She did not say very much. She asked 3 questions, the same 3 precise questions her mother had asked her cardiologist when they told her about her heart. Margaret did not know she had inherited this from Eleanor. But she had. When Richard finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Say the number again." He said it again. She said, "The full number." He said the full number. $85,412,000,000, distributed across real estate holdings, media assets, private equity investments, and liquid accounts in 4 countries, with an additional $12 million in personal property including the house on the long road flanked by white oak trees with names. Margaret said, "Okay." She said, "What do I need to do?" Richard told her. She listened. She said okay again. And then she said something that Richard Marsh would remember for the rest of his career. She said, "She knew, didn't she?" He paused. And then he said, "She knew everything." Margaret drove back to the house. Derek was on a phone call in his office, the door half closed, speaking in a tone she recognized as his business voice, controlled, confident, performing stability for whoever was on the other end. She walked past the door. She went to the kitchen. She made herself a cup of coffee. And she stood at the window looking at the backyard, the garden Derek had designed and never once worked in himself, and she did something she had not done in a very long time. She thought. Not about Derek. Not about what he would say or what he would want or what the consequences would be if she did the wrong thing. She thought about her mother. She thought about a library with 4,000 books and floors that did not creak and the smell of something always on the stove. She thought about a woman who had spent 40 years building something in silence and who had, in the final room of her final plan, made sure that silence could not be used against her daughter. And then Margaret Calloway finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, set it in the dish rack, and walked down the hall to find a divorce attorney. She did not tell Derek. She did not fight Derek. She did not confront Derek across the kitchen island with the number Richard had given her, did not watch his face change, did not give him the satisfaction of a scene. She did what her mother had done for 40 years. She moved quietly. She was methodical. She had her first meeting with a family law attorney named Sandra Pierce on a Thursday afternoon, telling Derek she was going to the grocery store. She had her second meeting the following Monday. She signed the first documents on a Friday morning when Derek was out of town for a deal that was, she would later discover, already 3 months from collapsing under the weight of his debts. She did not tell anyone. She did not call Dorothy. She did not call her one remaining friend from the gallery days, a woman named Cynthia who had drifted away slowly over a decade of increasingly infrequent contact. She sat with it herself, in the quiet house, moving carefully from room to room, and she prepared. She attended a private memorial for her mother 6 weeks after Eleanor's passing. She went alone, on a Saturday morning when Derek thought she was getting her hair done. It was held in the garden of the Hartfield house in Raleigh, and it was small, Dorothy, 3 of Eleanor's closest friends, Richard Marsh, and the housekeeper who had found Eleanor that March morning and who arrived with a single white flower she set on the table beside Eleanor's photograph. Margaret stood at the edge of the garden among the white oaks whose names she had learned as a child, and she spoke to her mother without saying anything out loud. She stayed for 2 hours. She drove back to Richmond in silence. She did not cry until she was on the interstate, where nobody could see her, and then she cried the way people cry when they have been holding something for a very long time and the road ahead is straight and empty and there is nothing left to perform for anyone. Derek was served with divorce papers on a Wednesday morning in June. It was a week before he was scheduled to appear in court for a separate matter. A creditor had filed a claim against one of his development LLCs, and the case had moved faster than his attorney had anticipated. He was on a call with that attorney when the process server arrived at the door. He signed for the envelope. He opened it. He read the first page. He went back into his office and closed the door, and his attorney, still on the phone, said, "Derek, are you there?" And Derek, for perhaps the first time in 12 years, had nothing to say. He tried, in the weeks that followed, to understand the scope of what he had missed. He sent messages to Margaret that she did not respond to, because Sandra Pierce had advised her not to respond to anything that did not come through legal channels. He contacted his own attorney and explained the situation, and the attorney went very quiet and then asked him to clarify the number he had just said. Derek clarified. The attorney was quiet for a longer time. Then he said, "Derek, I need you to understand something. Your wife inherited this money as a sole beneficiary under a trust structure that your mother-in-law spent years designing specifically. There is a clause, and this was filed before your marriage experienced any legal changes, that governs disclosure and asset protection under your state's marital property laws." He said, "This was not an accident." He said, "Someone planned for this." Derek said he knew that. He said, "Who?" And his attorney said, "Someone who knew you better than you thought." Derek's legal team filed a challenge to the estate structure in September. It lasted 11 months. It cost Derek an amount of money he did not have, drawn from accounts that were already overextended. His attorney argued timing, argued the clause, argued the disclosure structure. The judge, a woman named Honorable Claire Whitfield, who had been on the family court bench for 19 years and who had, in that time, developed a particular patience for exactly this category of case, listened to every argument with complete attention. And then she ruled. Cleanly. Precisely. Without ambiguity. The trust structure was valid. The clause was valid. The asset protections were valid. Eleanor's plan had been executed exactly as she and Richard Marsh had designed it over 3 years of careful, methodical construction. There was nothing to contest. Derek's attorney did not file an appeal. They left the building and did not come back. Derek Calloway filed for personal bankruptcy 14 months after the divorce was finalized. His Richmond brokerage closed. The development in Charlotte that had consumed so much of his hidden borrowing was eventually taken over by a creditor and sold at a significant loss. The second mortgage he had taken on the Richmond house, which had been sold as part of the divorce settlement, with proceeds going to offset the marital debt he had accumulated, was resolved through the sale, but barely. He moved into an apartment in the Fan district of Richmond, a one-bedroom on the second floor of a building that was perfectly fine and nothing like the life he had spent 12 years performing. His phone, in the months after everything fell apart, went very quiet. The people who had returned his calls when he was building deals did not return them now. This is one of the more reliable things about the world. Margaret Calloway, who went back to Hartfield as her legal name the morning the divorce was finalized, did not give interviews. She did not appear in the financial press, which ran 2 stories about the estate transfer in the spring before moving on to other things. She did not call anyone to tell them what had happened, because the people who mattered already knew and the people who didn't did not need to. She moved back to Raleigh. Not to the Hartfield house, which she decided to preserve as it was, the library with 4,000 books, the kitchen that always smelled like something was on the stove, the white oaks with names, but to a smaller house 10 minutes away, one she had found herself and chosen herself and written the check for herself without asking anyone's opinion. She repainted the front door a particular shade of green she had always liked and that Derek had once called impractical. She planted things in the garden. She started painting again. Quietly, without announcement, the way her mother had always built things. Canvases started appearing in her spare room, landscapes mostly, long flat horizons and big open skies. She was not trying to be good at it. She was just doing it. 6 months after moving back to Raleigh, Margaret Hartfield established the Eleanor Hartfield Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to legal support and financial literacy for women navigating coercive control in intimate relationships. The foundation opened an office in Raleigh and 2 satellite locations in Charlotte and Durham. It partnered with family law attorneys across North Carolina to provide pro bono representation to women who could not afford it. It offered workshops, not on leaving, because leaving is not always the first thing, and Margaret knew this better than most, but on knowing. On understanding your own financial situation. On understanding what your name is and is not on. On understanding that the quietest room in a marriage is not always the safest one. Margaret hired a small staff and a director she trusted, and she came into the office on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and she sat in meetings and asked precise questions and listened carefully and went home and painted in her spare room and called Dorothy on Wednesday evenings. She did not speak publicly about her marriage. She did not need to. Derek Calloway was photographed once, about 2 years after the bankruptcy filing, at a small real estate conference in Richmond. He was wearing a good jacket and standing at the edge of a reception, holding a glass of sparkling water he had not touched. He was still attractive in the way that men in their mid-30s can be, still carrying himself with a particular quality of confidence. But the woman who recognized him from the conference badge and who later described the encounter online said that there was something different about him now. Something that had not been there before, or that maybe had always been there but had been harder to see when things were going well. She said he looked like a man who was still performing but had forgotten, slightly, what the performance was for. He left the reception early. Nobody followed him out. Margaret Hartfield visited her mother's grave on a Tuesday morning in October, 2 years after Eleanor's death. She brought no flowers. Eleanor had always found cut flowers wasteful, beautiful things removed from their roots for the sake of a gesture. She brought a small stone instead, the way people do. She set it at the base of the headstone and she stood there for a long time without saying anything. The cemetery was quiet that morning. The oaks along the path were beginning to turn. There is something about October in North Carolina. The light gets a particular quality, low and amber and generous, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory even while you're still in it. Margaret stood in that light for a while. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular and to one person specifically, "I hear you now." She drove home. She made herself lunch. She painted for 3 hours in the spare room. She called Dorothy at 6. She slept well. The house was quiet in the way that good houses are, not empty, not lonely, just still. Outside, the oaks moved in a light wind. The front door was green. And the life that had been carefully, quietly, architecturally designed to wait for her, finally, fully, completely, was hers. There is a thing that people say about the women who survive stories like this one. They say, she got lucky. They say, imagine if her mother hadn't had all that money. And there is truth in that. Margaret Hartfield did inherit $85 billion, and that inheritance gave her something that most women in controlled marriages do not have access to, the ability to leave cleanly, to fight legally, to rebuild completely. But here is the thing that the luck framing misses. The money did not save Margaret. Eleanor saved Margaret. A woman who watched her daughter disappear by degrees over 12 years and who did not panic, did not intervene before her daughter was ready, did not force a crisis that would have sent Margaret retreating further, but who instead worked quietly, precisely, and with extraordinary patience to make sure that when the moment came, the door was not just unlocked but standing open with the lights on. That is not luck. That is a mother doing the hardest, longest, most loving thing a person can do. Waiting. Preparing. And trusting that her daughter would find her way to it when she was ready. Margaret was ready on a Tuesday morning in March, standing in a bedroom doorway holding a gray sweater and a pair of dark trousers while her husband told her she was not going to her mother's funeral. She didn't know it yet. She didn't walk out that morning. She sat back down on the bed and she put the clothes on the floor and she picked up her phone. But something shifted in her that morning, quietly, without announcement, the way the first thing shifts before everything else does. Derek Calloway told his wife she was not going anywhere. And he was right. She wasn't going anywhere that day. But she was already, in every way that mattered, already gone. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer. How many small moments did it take? How many quiet Tuesday mornings? How many gray sweaters put back on the floor? How many phone calls cut short? How many Wednesday evenings with a mother who was watching and waiting and writing things down in a small leather notebook? How many moments did it take before the weight of them finally became impossible to carry? Because here is what I think you already know. It is never one moment. It is never one morning. It is 100 mornings, 1,000 small surrenders, a decade of telling yourself that fine is the same as okay and okay is the same as good. And it stops, when it stops, not because of one dramatic scene but because something inside you remembers, without being asked, what you were before you learned to be careful. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And from wherever you are watching tonight, whether that is Charlotte, or Chicago, or Phoenix, or a front porch somewhere in North Carolina where the oaks are starting to turn, I am glad you are here. Subscribe. Stay close. Because next time, the story is even more extraordinary. And you will not want to come in late.